Liberal journalist publicly mocks Clint Eastwood. His stunning response leaves everyone silent. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. The glow of the studio lights bathed the set of Late Night Spotlight in a bright, polished sheen. It was the stage where Fiona Carrington reigned supreme. Known for her acerbic wit, unapologetic progressive stance, and fearless approach to cultural and political issues, she had carved out a unique niche in the world of late-night television. Her audience tuned in nightly, eager to watch her dismantle high-profile guests with sharp humor, piercing observations, and an unrelenting stream of sarcastic quips. It was during a routine production meeting that one of her producers floated an unexpected idea, inviting Clint Eastwood to the show. The room buzzed with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Clint was a Hollywood legend, a man whose on-screen presence was unmistakable. Over the years, he had been both celebrated and criticized. His iconic roles in spaghetti westerns and gritty dramas had cemented him as a cinematic powerhouse. Yet, in some circles, his outspoken conservative views often overshadowed his artistic legacy. Fiona's eyes lit up at the suggestion. This wasn't just an opportunity for a ratings boost. It was a chance to challenge and dissect a figure who, in her view, represented outdated ideals. It was precisely the kind of spectacle her audience loved. Fiona never approached a task unprepared. She dove into her research with laser focus, watching clips of Clint's films and past interviews, scribbling notes in the margins of her outline. The thought of juxtaposing her razor-sharp modernity against Clint's stoic, old-school demeanor brought a smirk to her lips. To her, this wasn't just another interview, it was a showdown. Meanwhile, at his ranch in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat at his wooden kitchen table, the invitation letter in one hand and a steaming cup of black coffee in the other. His assistant, a younger man named Jack, studied Clint carefully before breaking the silence. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with concern. Fiona Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory. Clint gave a faint smile, his weathered face betraying neither irritation nor concern. "Friendly or not, a conversation's a conversation," he said simply. Jack remained unconvinced. He had seen enough of Fiona's interviews to know how merciless she could be. "She's going to come after you. Politics, your movies, probably even your age." Clint shrugged. "Let her." He set the letter down, gazing out at the rolling hills beyond his ranch. Sometimes it's not about winning or losing, it's about showing up. As the interview drew closer, Fiona's team meticulously crafted her questions, ensuring every point was loaded with irony and humor, designed to elicit laughter from the audience. Clint, on the other hand, refused to rehearse. He had no comebacks prepared, no scripted responses, only his instincts to guide him. The studio buzzed with energy on the night of the show. The live audience took their seats, a mix of Fiona's regular fans and curious viewers who had come to witness the clash. Backstage, Fiona rehearsed her opening monologue, a confident smirk on her lips. "Tonight's going to be legendary," she told her head writer, Veronica. "It's going to be a ratings hit for sure," Veronica agreed. "Clint Eastwood, he's a walking symbol of everything your audience loves to critique." "Just remember," Veronica added, "keep it playful. Don't give him too much room to respond." Fiona chuckled, adjusting her microphone. "Please, he's 94 years old. He's not going to keep up with me." Meanwhile, Clint arrived at the studio with little fanfare. Dressed in a tailored blazer and jeans, he moved with a quiet confidence that turned heads. Jack, trailing behind, was still visibly uneasy. "Last chance to back out," Jack murmured as they neared the green room. Clint chuckled, his voice steady. "You worry too much, it's just a conversation." As the show's opening sequence played, Clint sat in the green room, sipping water and watching the monitors. He listened to the audience's cheers as Fiona was introduced. Jack fidgeted beside him. "Look at that crowd," he muttered. "They're already eating out of her hand." Clint glanced at the screen, watching as Fiona stepped onto the stage with her signature confidence. "That's her job," he said simply. "Mine's to tell the truth. Let's see what happens." On stage, Fiona launched into her monologue. Her delivery was polished, energetic, every word carefully calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, grinning, "we've got a legend in the house tonight. Clint Eastwood, an icon of Hollywood, a symbol of old-school masculinity, and a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is good entertainment." The audience erupted in laughter, some even clapping. Fiona continued, firing off quips about Clint's movies, politics, and even his age. Backstage, Clint watched with mild amusement, his expression unreadable. Jack, however, shifted uncomfortably. "She's laying it on thick," he muttered. "Let her have her fun," Clint said. Finally, Fiona introduced Clint. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was mixed, cheers mingling with a smattering of boos. He shook Fiona's hand firmly, his face calm and composed. Then, tipping his hat to the audience, he earned a few scattered laughs. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to the show," Fiona began, her tone polite but edged with mockery. "Thanks for having me," Clint replied. "Nice crowd you've got here." The tension in the room was almost palpable. Fiona leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Oh, they're great. They love a good debate. Ready to dive in?" Clint smiled faintly. "Always." And with that, the curtain was raised on their verbal duel. The studio brimmed with anticipation, both host and guest poised, though for entirely different reasons. Fiona was ready to dominate. Clint? He simply sat back, knowing he had nothing to prove. Clint chuckled, the sound low and rough, as the audience responded with laughter, clearly still on Fiona's side. He tilted his head slightly, considering her question before speaking in that gravelly, measured tone that had become his signature. "Well, Fiona," he said, his voice steady, "I've always believed work isn't about age. It's about what you bring to the table. Whether you're 25 or 94, if you've got something worth saying or doing, why stop?" His calm, collected response earned a few polite claps from the audience, but Fiona wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "Sure," she said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the debate. "But times change, don't they? I mean, your early films, they're classics, no doubt, but let's be honest, they're not exactly known for their progressive representation of women or minorities. Do you ever feel like maybe those old-school values you portrayed don't hold up anymore?" The audience burst into laughter and applause, clearly entertained by her pointed question. Clint, however, remained unfazed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, taking a moment before responding. "I think it's important to remember," he began, his voice even, "that films are a reflection of their time. They capture what people were thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some of it doesn't age well, but that's true of anything in life. Progress isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it." The laughter in the studio died down as the audience absorbed his words. There was a noticeable shift in energy. Where before they had been eager to cheer Fiona's sharp jabs, now there was a flicker of reflection in their expressions. Fiona, sensing the change, quickly switched gears. "Fair point," she conceded with a slight shrug. "But let's talk politics. You've been pretty vocal about your views over the years, and let's just say they don't exactly line up with a lot of this audience. Do you ever worry that being so outspoken might alienate people who used to look up to you?" Clint's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable but composed. "I've always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for," he said simply. "If that means some people don't like me, so be it. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about standing by your principles, even when it's not convenient." A murmur ran through the audience, a mixture of agreement and skepticism. Fiona, determined to keep the upper hand, leaned in, her voice tinged with mock concern. "But don't you think that kind of stubbornness can come across as out of touch?" she asked. "I mean, the world's moving forward and some might say you're clinging to the past." Clint chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "You call it clinging," he said, his voice deliberate. "I call it staying grounded. The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes, in its rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before." For the first time that night, the studio fell silent. The audience, caught off guard by the clarity and simplicity of his statement, hesitated. Even Fiona faltered slightly, sensing the balance of power shifting. She recovered quickly, but there was a new weight to her voice. "Fair enough," she said after a pause, her tone light. "But surely you can admit there's room for improvement in the way we used to do things." Of course, Clint replied immediately, without hesitation. There's always room for improvement. But improvement doesn't mean throwing away the foundation. It means building on it. You can't write a new chapter if you're too busy tearing out the old pages. The audience, who'd been so eager to cheer Fiona's jabs, now sat in thoughtful silence. Even Fiona, known for her quick wit and sharp comebacks, found herself momentarily at a loss for words. The exchange continued, with Fiona throwing sharp, calculated questions while Clint met each one with measured, unwavering responses. The contrast between them was stark, one fueled by energy and provocation, the other by calm conviction. Slowly but surely, the balance of power on stage began to shift. The audience, once firmly on Fiona's side, started to see Clint in a different light. By the time they neared the final stretch of the interview, Fiona's attempts at humor felt forced, while Clint's authenticity resonated more and more. It was clear this was no ordinary interview. Fiona leaned into her desk, her smile fixed and practiced, as she fired off another pointed question. "Let's talk about those westerns," she said, her tone playful but cutting. "Do you ever feel like the characters you played, tough guys with guns, solving problems with violence, contributed to some of the, let's say, less than healthy ideas about masculinity we see today?" The audience roared with laughter, clapping and cheering at Fiona's well-crafted jab. She sat back, basking in the energy of the room. Clint, however, remained unshaken. He gave a small nod, his lips curling into a faint smile as he let the laughter die down. "Well, Fiona," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, "I think it's easy to look at things through the lens of today and forget what they represented back then. Those characters weren't just tough guys with guns. They were symbols of resilience, independence, and the fight for justice in a world that didn't always play fair. If that's toxic, then I guess we've got different definitions." The room fell silent. The laughter and cheers from moments ago had vanished, replaced by an air of curiosity. Fiona blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to meet her sharp criticism with such steady conviction. She recovered quickly. "That's an interesting take," she said, "but surely you can admit that some of those films glorified violence, right? Don't you think that sends the wrong message, especially to younger audiences?" Clint leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. "Violence is a part of life, Fiona. Always has been," he said. "But those stories weren't about glorifying it. They were about confronting it. They were about characters who had to make hard choices in a tough world. Life isn't clean or simple, and sometimes you have to face the ugliness head-on to protect what matters." The gravity in his voice silenced the audience. Even Fiona seemed to hesitate. Sensing the shift, she attempted a pivot. "Fair enough," she said, forcing a smile, "but let's move on from the past, let's talk about now. Your political views, some would say controversial. Do you think that's hurt your legacy?" Clint sat back, his face thoughtful but unbothered. "Maybe it has," he admitted, "but I've never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I've been interested in being honest." For a moment, Fiona hesitated. Her usual strategy of turning her guests' words against them wasn't working. Clint wasn't defensive, nor was he flustered.
Instead, his quiet sincerity was starting to win over the room. And for the first time that night, Fiona wasn't sure if she was still in control of the conversation. Clint let his gaze sweep the room, his eyes moving from face to face, taking in the expressions of an audience that had just moments ago been eager to mock him. "Most people would have quit," he said, his voice steady, "but I didn't. Not because I thought I'd make it big, not because I had any guarantees, but because something inside me said, 'Keep going.'" His words hung in the air, simple yet powerful. "I worked harder," he continued. "I learned from every mistake, every rejection. I studied people, how they walked, how they talked, how they carried themselves. And when the roles didn't come, I didn't sit around waiting. I built furniture, taught myself to work with my hands. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me going." Fiona, who had been preparing to jump in with another sharp question, found herself unable to interrupt. There was something in Clint's voice, a sincerity, a raw honesty, that disarmed her usual defenses.
"And then one day I got lucky," Clint said, a faint smile crossing his lips. A small studio needed someone to play a cowboy. They didn't think much of me. I wasn't their first choice. But I had the right look, and more importantly, I came at the right price. The audience chuckled softly, sensing the humble humor in his words. They didn't have to pay me much, Clint continued. That's how I landed Rawhide. It wasn't a big deal at the time, just another TV show, but for me, it was everything. It was a chance to prove that I could do this. So I gave it my all. He paused, his eyes distant for a moment, as if reliving those early days. The funny thing about opportunities is that they don't come with guarantees, he said. You get your shot, and it's up to you what you do with it. I worked harder than I ever had, not because I wanted fame or money, but because I wanted to respect the chance I'd been given. And slowly, things started to change. I learned, I grew, I got better. The studio was silent now. Gone were the jeers, the laughter, the light-hearted taunts, replaced by a quiet reverence. Even Fiona, who had started the night preparing to tear Clint apart, found herself leaning closer, her sharp wit momentarily forgotten. Clint's tone deepened. But Hollywood, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, tests you. Success doesn't mean the challenges stop. If anything, they get harder. People try to shape you, tell you what you can and can't do. I had to fight to stay true to myself. He looked at the audience, his expression calm but firm. There were times when I turned down roles because they didn't feel right, even when I needed the money. I wasn't interested in being someone else's idea of a star. I just wanted to do good work and be honest about who I was. A young man in the crowd nodded, his face thoughtful, while a middle-aged woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Clint's words weren't just a recounting of his life. They were a mirror, reflecting struggles and decisions that resonated with everyone in the room. Fiona cleared her throat, her voice quieter than usual. That's quite a journey, she admitted, the edge in her tone noticeably absent. But surely there were times you doubted yourself, times when you wanted to give up? Clint nodded, his face softening. Of course, he said. Everyone has doubts, Fiona, but the thing is, doubt is just part of the process. It's not a sign to stop. It's a sign to keep going. And if you stay true to yourself, the path becomes clear, even if it's not easy. The studio was silent. The weight of Clint's words settled over the room like a warm blanket. Fiona leaned back in her chair. For the first time, she was unsure of what to say next. Clint had done something remarkable. He had taken a stage set for confrontation and turned it into a space for reflection and connection. As the segment ended, the camera crew signaled a commercial break and the audience erupted in applause. But this applause was different. It wasn't the polite clapping that followed Fiona's monologue. It was genuine, heartfelt, the kind of applause reserved for moments that truly matter. Clint, ever humble, gave a small nod, his smile faint but warm.
For Fiona, the realization began to dawn. This wasn't going to be the takedown she had envisioned.
Clint Eastwood wasn't just an old actor with outdated ideas.
He was a man who had lived through battles, both on screen and off, and had come out with a wisdom impossible to ignore. As the applause faded, the studio lights dimmed slightly, creating a more intimate atmosphere. Clint leaned back in his chair, his posture calm but deliberate, as if he were sitting across from an old friend rather than facing a sharp-tongued host. Fiona, noticeably subdued, hesitated before steering the conversation forward. Clint, she began, her tone softer now. You've talked a lot about your experiences in Hollywood and staying true to yourself. But let's be honest. Life isn't always that simple. What about when things get so hard that resilience doesn't feel like enough? Surely, even you have faced moments where giving up seemed easier. Clint nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. You're right, he said. There were plenty of times when it felt easier to throw in the towel. I'm not immune to doubt or fear. None of us are. But resilience isn't about never feeling those things. It's about how you respond to them. The audience listened intently, their earlier skepticism replaced with genuine curiosity. You know, Clint continued, I think people misunderstand resilience. They think it's about being tough all the time, about never breaking or bending. But that's not it. Resilience is about learning how to bend without breaking. It's about knowing that even when life knocks you down, you've got the strength to stand back up, no matter how many times it happens. Fiona tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. And where do you think that strength comes from? She asked, her voice no longer challenging, but curious. Clint gave a faint smile. From the little things, he said. From the people who believe in you when you don't believe in yourself. From the lessons you learn the hard way. From the mistakes that teach you who you are. And most importantly, from knowing your purpose. If you don't know your why, resilience is a lot harder to find. The crowd was utterly silent. Even Fiona, who had spent her career dominating conversations, found herself pausing to absorb his message. For the first time that night, Clint wasn't just an interview guest. He was a man sharing something real, something raw, and the entire room felt it. The interview was no longer a battle. It had become something much more powerful, a conversation that no one in that room would ever forget. Clint's eyes twinkled, a faint smile playing on his lips. You call it stubbornness, he said, but I call it integrity. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and refusing to compromise on that, no matter how tempting it might be. The word hung in the air, integrity. Fiona tilted her head, intrigued. But isn't there a cost to that? She pressed. I mean, staying true to yourself is admirable, sure. But what about the opportunities you lose, the people you alienate? Doesn't it get lonely? Clint paused, considering her question. There's always a cost, he admitted, but the cost of losing yourself is far greater. I've seen too many people in this industry and in life give up pieces of themselves to fit in, to be liked, to succeed. And maybe in the short term, they get what they wanted, but in the long run, they end up empty. Because when you lose your integrity, you lose the thing that makes you, you. The audience was silent. Now, no laughter, no murmurs, just a quiet nut that spoke volumes. His words had hit home. Fiona nodded slowly, sensing the weight of his statement. Can you give us an example? She asked, her voice softer now. Oh. Clint leaned forward, his hands clasped together. There was a time early in my career, he began, when I was offered a big role. It would have paid well, it could have put me on the map, but the character they wanted me to play, he was someone I didn't respect. Someone whose actions went against everything I believed in. The audience listened intently, drawn into his story. I needed the money, I wanted the exposure, but something in me said, this isn't right. Clint paused, his voice steady. So I turned it down. Fiona raised an eyebrow. And how did that work out for you? She asked, a slight smirk returning. Clint chuckled, shaking his head. Not great at first, he admitted. I struggled for a while after that, but eventually I got another opportunity, one that aligned with my values, and because I stayed true to myself, I was ready for it. If I had taken that first role, I might have made some quick cash, but I wouldn't have been proud of what I was putting into the world. And that matters to me. The audience, previously so eager to cheer for Fiona's clever jabs, now sat in thoughtful silence. Clint's story wasn't just a recounting of his past, it was a lesson about the importance of staying true to oneself, even when it was difficult. Fiona tapped her pen on the desk, her skepticism flickering. But Hollywood's not exactly known for rewarding integrity, she said. Don't you think that kind of idealism is, well, a bit outdated? Clint leaned back, his expression calm but firm. Maybe it is, he said, but that doesn't make it any less important. Integrity isn't about being rewarded. It's about being able to look in the mirror and say, I did the right thing. And that's not outdated. That's timeless. A young woman in the audience wiped away a tear, her face reflecting a mix of admiration and self-reflection. A man near the back nodded, his arms crossed, his expression thoughtful. Clint's words weren't just landing, they were sparking something deeper in the crowd. Fiona shifted in her seat, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. It sounds like you've never doubted your choices, she said, trying to regain her footing. But surely there have been moments when you wondered if it was worth it? Clint nodded without hesitation. Of course there were, he said. I'm human, Fiona. There were times I questioned myself, times I wondered if I was being too stubborn, too idealistic. But every time I faced one of those moments, I reminded myself why I started. I reminded myself that success without integrity isn't really success, it's just an illusion. The audience erupted in applause. Not the raucous, performative applause that had followed Fiona's opening monologue, but something deeper, more heartfelt. Clint nodded slightly, his face calm but grateful. Fiona glanced at the audience, realizing the shift in the room. What had started as a light-hearted adversarial interview had turned into something far more profound. Clint Eastwood, whom she had intended to mock as a relic of the past, had turned the conversation into a powerful reflection on integrity, self-respect, and purpose. As the applause died down, Fiona turned back to Clint. I have to admit, she said, her tone genuine, you've given me, and I think everyone here, a lot to think about. Clint smiled faintly. That's all I can hope for, he said. Life isn't about convincing everyone to agree with you. It's about planting seeds and letting people make their own decisions. If my words help someone along the way, that's enough for me. The camera zoomed in on Clint's face, capturing his calm, steady expression. The moment felt almost sacred, a rare pause in the fast-paced world of late-night television. The audience, once ready to mock the Hollywood legend, now sat in awe, their earlier skepticism replaced by deep respect. The studio felt different now. The energy that had started the night, lively, charged with anticipation, had transformed into something quieter, more introspective. As the interview continued, Clint's calm demeanor and heartfelt words had done something Fiona never expected. The crowd, which had been firmly on her side, now seemed to hang on Clint's every word. Even Fiona, still composed, could feel the shift. You know, Clint said, breaking the silence that had settled after a particularly poignant moment, it's easy to get caught up in the noise. The world is loud these days. Opinions everywhere, people shouting to be heard. But the truth? The truth is usually found in the quiet moments, when no one's looking. The audience was utterly still. Captivated, Fiona, usually quick with a witty retort, found herself pausing, letting his words sink in. She glanced at the camera crew. They were unusually subdued, their focus sharper than ever, capturing the emotion of the moment. I've been in a lot of noisy rooms, Clint continued, his voice low and steady. Hollywood parties, film sets, political debates. And you know what I've learned? Noise doesn't mean substance. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one you should listen to. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who have the most to say. Fiona shifted in her chair. For years, she had thrived on being the loudest voice in the room. But now, sitting across from Clint Eastwood, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was she truly listening or just waiting for her turn to speak? And for the first time all night, she didn't know the answer. The studio remained silent, and in that silence, Clint had already won. The usual electric buzz of late-night spotlight was gone. Instead, a subdued stillness lingered in the air, as if the weight of Clint Eastwood's words still hung in the space. As the show wrapped up, the audience rose from their seats, some murmuring softly to each other, others still lost in thought. Fiona remained at her desk, motionless for a moment, staring at her carefully crafted notes. They now felt hollow, meaningless. She glanced at Clint, who was rising slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate yet graceful for a man of his age. He turned to the audience, tipping his hat one last time, earning a small wave of applause and nods of respect. As Clint stepped off the stage and made his way backstage, crew members and producers approached him hesitantly, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration. A young camera operator, barely out of college, stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and nervous. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice slightly shaky, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you said tonight really hit home." Clint gave him a small but genuine smile, his handshake firm but warm. "Glad to hear it, son," he said. "Life's all about finding what matters to you and holding on to it. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, Fiona retreated to her dressing room, her mind racing. The show hadn't gone as she had planned. It had been something entirely different. For years, she had prided herself on her ability to dominate conversations, to outwit and outmaneuver even the most formidable guests. But tonight she had been disarmed. She closed the door to her dressing room and sank into the chair in front of her vanity. She stared at her reflection, her makeup still flawless under the harsh lights, yet her expression told another story. She felt exposed. As if Clint's words had peeled back a layer she hadn't even realized was there. "Was I listening?" she whispered to herself. The question lingered in the air, haunting in its simplicity. Backstage, Clint was gathering his belongings when Fiona's producer, Veronica, approached him. Her usual confidence was missing. Instead, she hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice softer than usual, "I just wanted to say that was incredible. I don't think we've ever had a guest who could command the room like that." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "I wasn't trying to command anything," he said, "just speaking my truth. People listen when they're ready to hear it." Veronica nodded, the respect in her eyes evident. "Well, you definitely gave us all something to think about." As Clint exited the studio, he found his assistant Jack waiting for him by the car. Jack's expression was a mix of relief and admiration. "I have to say, Clint," Jack said, opening the car door for him, "I wasn't sure how that was going to go, but you handled it like a pro." Clint eased into the passenger seat, glancing back at the studio one last time. "It's not about handling, Jack," he said. "It's about being yourself. The rest takes care of itself." The drive back to his hotel was quiet, the city lights casting long shadows on the streets. Clint stared out the window, his expression calm but reflective. He wasn't one to dwell on moments, but even he could feel that this night had been different. The next morning, clips from the interview flooded social media. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, some praising Clint for his wisdom, others criticizing Fiona for her approach. Yet the overwhelming sentiment was one of respect for both Clint's unwavering authenticity and the unexpected vulnerability of the conversation. Clint Eastwood, a masterclass in integrity, began trending as users dissected his statements and shared how they resonated with their own lives. Fiona's show, typically known for its sharp humor and biting wit, was being talked about for entirely different reasons. Back at her apartment, Fiona scrolled through the responses. She read comments that ranged from admiration for Clint to critiques of her handling of the interview. She leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying the conversation. For the first time in her career, she felt unsure, not about her talent or her ability, but about her approach. Clint's words had forced her to confront a question she had avoided for years. Was I using my platform to genuinely connect or just to dominate? The thought lingered as she opened her laptop. Slowly, she began typing a statement, something she rarely did in response to her own episodes. It was short, but it felt necessary. Last night's conversation with Clint Eastwood reminded me of the power of listening. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for sharing your wisdom and perspective. You gave us all a lot to think about. She hit publish and leaned back, exhaling deeply. For Clint, the day moved on as any other. He returned to his quiet life, unbothered by the buzz around the interview. He had said what he needed to say, and that was enough. For Fiona, however, the conversation marked a turning point, a moment that would linger, reshaping how she approached her career and the world around her. And for the audience, the night had been more than just entertainment. It had been a reminder that amidst the noise, the quiet power of integrity and truth still had the ability to move hearts and minds. In the days that followed, the episode continued to go viral. It wasn't for its humor or Fiona's usual wit, but for the raw honesty Clint had brought to the conversation. Social media, often a battleground for polarized opinions, found itself surprisingly united. People across generations and political divides praised Clint's calm demeanor and heartfelt wisdom. A clip of him saying integrity isn't about being popular, it's about living with yourself, was viewed millions of times. It became a rallying cry, a symbol for those longing for authenticity in a world increasingly consumed by noise and pretense. For Clint, the aftermath was quieter. Back at his ranch in Carmel, he spent his days as he always did, working with his hands, enjoying the peace of his surroundings, and reflecting on the simpler joys of life. When Jack showed him a flood of articles praising the interview, Clint simply chuckled. "Looks like you broke the internet, Clint," Jack said, scrolling through headlines. "People are calling it one of the most powerful late-night interviews in years." Clint shrugged, his expression amused. "It's funny how the simplest things make the biggest noise. I wasn't trying to break anything, Jack, just saying what needed to be said." Jack grinned. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. People are calling it a masterclass in authenticity." Clint smiled faintly. Funny how rare that seems to be these days. And with that, he went back to his quiet life, letting the world reflect on the words he had already spoken. Because sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest truths.